She was standing right outside the mall, holding a small paper bag and a folded receipt, like proof of innocence. The kind of ordinary detail people believe keeps you safe. It didn't. The late afternoon sun made her silver-white hair glow, her pale skin almost translucent. She didn't look dangerous. She looked visible. People walked past without a second glance, until the glass doors slid open behind her. Rick Daly stepped out. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He raised his phone and said one word like a verdict: loitering. 2 officers moved in immediately. Officer Trent Coyle, broad, rigid, already angry. Officer Mason Briggs, smiling, the kind of smile that shows up when power thinks it's untouchable. They surrounded the girl before she could take a step back. "What's in the bag?" Coyle snapped. Her name was Maya Clarke. She lifted the bag with shaking hands. Inside was a small ceramic mug wrapped in tissue paper, a gift. She unfolded the receipt and held it out. "I bought it 15 minutes ago," she said quietly. Phones came out. Cameras framed the moment. The proof was right there. It didn't matter. Coyle grabbed her arm. Briggs drove his knee into her shoulder and slammed her onto the concrete. The sound wasn't dramatic, just fabric, breath, bone against pavement. Blood appeared fast, bright against pale skin. Handcuffs closed around wrists that had only ever known piano keys and homework. "You're under arrest," Coyle barked, "for loitering and resisting." Maya was crying now. "My mother is coming," she said through tears. She's Special Agent Maya Clarke." For a second, the crowd went quiet. The officers laughed. Then everything changed. She was holding a small paper bag and a folded receipt like a talisman, the kind of ordinary thing that makes the rest of the world believe you're harmless. The late afternoon sun made her hair almost glow. Her skin, pale and freckled at the bridge of the nose, looked more fragile than it felt. People passed by without looking twice. Then Rick Daly walked out from the glossy mall doors and everything bent toward him. Rick did not hesitate. He spoke into his phone with a tone that stripped the air of any neighborly courtesy. "Loitering," he said, as if the word itself would summon enforcement. 2 officers were already walking toward her. Officer Trent Coyle, broad-shouldered, every movement like a warning, and Officer Mason Briggs, who smiled too easily when authority mattered most. They arrived with the practiced decisiveness of men who had called the tune on smaller things before. "What's in the bag?" Coyle demanded, before any words had been introduced. The girl, Maya Clarke, turned, startled, and held it up. Inside was a small mug wrapped in tissue paper, the sort of thing teenagers buy for teachers or grandparents. She unfolded the receipt and put it under their noses. "Bought it 15 minutes ago," she said. She spoke politely because that was what she had been taught. Use your voice, offer proof. The phone cameras from a dozen pockets framed the moment, the brightness of the LED dots, the littleness of the gift, her hands trembling. Coyle reached for her arm. Mason leaned in, and before a single calm word could be exchanged, planted his knee into her shoulder and shoved her to the concrete. The sound was astonishing in its ordinariness, a flap of fabric, the gasp of a woman 2 feet away, the clap of a camera button. Her head struck the pavement hard enough to scrape the skin above her eyebrow, blood welled bright and immediate. Cuffs closed around delicate wrists that had only ever known the rhythm of piano scales and late-night homework. Someone shouted. Phones recorded. "You're under arrest for loitering and resisting," Coyle barked, voice practiced into cruelty. "You people always think you can—" He never finished the thought. For a full second, the officers had not seen who they had put their hands on. Maya kept blinking. Her cheeks were wet with tears she hadn't meant to let fall. "My mother is coming," she managed. She's Special Agent Maya Clarke." Her voice did something to the air. People around her made the calculations hearing the name. Strangers check facts like fortune tellers check tarot cards. A woman across the walkway looked up from her phone, eyes narrowing, and the tension in the crowd hummed. Coyle and Briggs exchanged a look that tried to be contemptuous and landed somewhere closer to irritation. "Who's your daddy?" Mason said, trying for a laugh and missing badly. The crowd's phones made silver crescents in the light. For a beat, the officers continued as if the badge on their chests was enough to crown them king. Then the call came. A black town car eased through the traffic in front of the mall. The door opened, and a woman stepped out so still she might have been carved. Maya Clarke moved without drama. She wore a low-cut coat buttoned at the throat, hair pulled back in a practical knot. Her badge flashed at the same instant she spoke. No flourish, only authority. The officers' faces did a private arithmetic. The rhythm changed. Where there had been force, there was suddenly discomfort. Maya crouched at the edge of the scene and took in the spilled carton, the mug, the receipt,
The smear of blood at Maya's temple, the dozen phones pointed at the same truth. Her fingers hovered for a second over Maya's shoulder, and then she did something she had been trained to do in 100 field operations. She steadied the narrative. "Names," she said quietly. "All of you. Badges. Body cameras. Store manager." Coyle's jaw worked as he cataloged defiance. "Agent Clarke," he said, too loud. "We were just—" "You were not on an emergency call," Mara replied. Her voice had no glee in it. It carried the weight of procedure and patience that was not unlimited.
She reached into her inner pocket, produced her credentials, and held them before sending them back toward the officers like an offering and a demand at once. The crowd watched how a badge reconfigured a battlefield. The officers' hands retreated from the edges of the incident. Briggs muttered something about paperwork. Daly hovered with smug satisfaction, as if he had authored the script and simply wanted the applause. Chief Ellen Whitaker emerged from the mall entrance, hair swept in a cautious, practiced way that had become her armor. She wore smiling alliances like jewelry. "Agent Clarke," she said, with a tone engineered to soothe, "let's step aside and—" Mara did not step aside. She inspected the cuff marks and wrote down names. She asked 100 quiet, precise questions that had nothing to do with the spectacle and everything to do with creating an official line between data and denial. "I want the footage," she said. "I want the manager's complaint, the logs, the timestamps on your cams." Her calm had edges. She accepted the apology that Chief Whitaker tried to lay like a blanket and folded it away as insufficient. A nurse from the mall offered a napkin and a hand. Maya's mother took the napkin, but she did not let Mara take the lead on an emotional exchange. That would blur the object at the center of the night, evidence. "Names and badge numbers," she repeated, "and I want to photograph her injuries." It was not the fury of someone who did not know how to be loud. It was the precision of someone who knew what would be needed if the moment turned legal, if someone tried to erase the facts. Whitaker smiled and suggested a private resolution, the kind of thinly veiled diplomacy elected officials learn young. "We can all handle this locally," she said. "A misunderstanding, a caution, the girl's guardians." The subtext was clear. Let's protect our own. Mara shook her head. "Not appropriate," she said simply. "Not when someone is injured, not when footage exists. I will be filing a request for the footage and the report. I will be here until I have it." From where Maya lay on the warm pavement, the world felt compressed, her forearms scraped, the edge of the receipt soggy and stuck to her fingers, the metal of the cuff cold and suddenly alien. Her phone, still in her pocket, vibrated with one call labeled Mom. The crowd's murmurs soft-sawed into something like anticipation. Someone in the back swore softly. People had stopped being mere extras and started to be witnesses. The first mini CTA came with the rhythm of the scene. The woman in the crowd, a stranger, shoved her phone forward and said to the nearest camera, to the invisible audience in everyone's pocket, "If you want the full breakdown of what happens next, stick around." It was not an ask for applause. It was a plea to watch. The officers' body cameras, according to Whitaker, were all functioning. They would share footage, she promised, and the mall's internal cameras would be made available. But there were two things Mara had learned about stories that involve people who stand to lose everything. The story you see and the story that gets preserved are often two different things. She photographed Maya's injuries, noted the time, demanded the complaint the manager said he'd filed. Whitaker promised also to preserve the tapes, and Daly hovered like a director whose set had been interrupted by a temperamental actor. At the police station, the first fissures appeared, where they'd always appear in these small-town scrapes: paperwork, servers, and the magic of lost logs. A desk sergeant told Mara there was no complaint on file. "We must have misplaced it," he said, palms up. Later, when Mara would review the time-coded footage from store cameras, the timestamps would show nothing missing. But right then, at the precinct, there was a clerk who said, with that weary look people get when they are asked to do something inconvenient, "We have had some database updates. Things are taking longer." Maya's mother took notes on everything. She did not shout, she did not threaten, because she knew how much quieter and more lethal paper could be than rage. "I want chain of custody," she said. "All the footage in its native format, all the logs. I will expect corporates to cooperate." Whitaker offered again the private meeting, the handshake that could smooth a whole town's reputation into a bruise no one acknowledged. Mara refused. In the days that followed, the story multiplied in the usual way, by being seen. Phones had captured slaps of sound in the bright smear of blood. The footage passed through tens, then hundreds of hands. Mullings in the high school hallway turned to whispered accusations, some on Maya's side, some her way. Deputies smirked at lunch. Someone on the school's administrative team, a deputy clean who had a habit of singing off-key to authority, quietly flagged Maya in an internal database as problem-prone, a tiny bureaucratic scar that would complicate applications and references and scribe a prejudiced future. The flag was later explained as a clerical note about frequent calls to her guardian, but the effect was the same. Institutional hairline fractures widened. Threats began the way they always do, small, anonymous, meant to be a kind of constant pressure.
A passerby later testified to seeing a car that cruised slowly past the Clarke house twice in a single night, then parked. The home security feed showed a sedan idling with its headlights off, the figure inside unreadable. Maya started receiving messages, one line, unsigned, that suggested that lines were better left uncrossed. The messages were menacing not because they promised violent outcomes, but because they suggested surveillance, an intimacy of threat that implied someone's hands were on a control room. Meanwhile, the police department narrative hardened like tar.
Body cams had supposedly popped offline during the altercation. A tech log would later show a signal interruption. The mall's internal system had overwritten footage due to a settings error. When Mara requested the original files, the official response came back slow and bureaucratic. "We are assembling backups," the statement read, a phrase meant to convey control but which in practice often buys time. Time, in this case, was what the local power players needed. Contracts had to be preserved. Grants that flowed toward detention capacity hinged on numbers that rarely survived public scrutiny. There were whispered rumors in the background, departmental budgets tied through pliant contracts to metrics that rewarded arrests and kept beds full in privately run facilities. The idea sat at the edge of everything and was dismissed in polite conversation with a laugh, conspiracy theory. Yet Mara, who had spent 20 years threading through procurement records and FOIA requests, had learned to sniff the paperwork for the scent of a system feeding itself. That scent is what coaxed Javier Ruiz out of the security booth 2 nights later. Javier had been in his 50s for years by demeanor, though he looked younger in the buzz of the mall fluorescence. He had worked the evening shift for a decade and could read the oval of the shopping center like a page. He'd seen other things, small humiliations, loud refusals of help, boys shoved into patrol cars because they were in the wrong section after dark. Javier had been an unofficial record keeper in the margins of boredom, saving clips to a hard drive when the main system cleared them. He did not want to be a hero, he wanted to be right. He copied the footage onto a thumb drive the size of his thumb and locked it in his locker for a week, until every night he had imagined bringing it to the right hands and then changed his mind. Fear makes ordinary choices into moral dilemmas. He feared losing his job. He feared the cost to his family if it was discovered he had undermined the cozy alignment of the mall and the department. But the image of a small, pale girl slammed into the concrete had lodged behind his ribs, and the thumb drive burned like a coal in his pocket. Javier came to Mara's office at an odd hour, an unremarkable man carrying a ridiculous object in this context, a reusable coffee cup, a cheap radio clip to his belt. He looked like nothing special. When he slid the thumb drive across Mara's polished desk, he looked away as if embarrassed. "I didn't want to be the one," he said, voice thinning, "but I kept it. I kept everything I could. They were told to clear the server last week." Mara's face did not change much as she inserted the drive into a reader. She had seen dozens of such drives before. That did not make the footage any less real.
The grainy images rolled across her screen. The mall entrance, the mug, the approach of 2 officers who moved with a deliberate momentum that wasn't justified by any clear threat. The shove, the slam, the cuffing, the blood. The camera cut to different angles, as Javier had been careful to stash copies from multiple sources: his feed, a camera in a side corridor, another that usually focused on store loitering. Some angles lacked sound. Others had crisp, exculpatory audio, the manager's voice, a shout from an officer that was indistinguishable in menace from a command. Renee Price arrived the next morning with a leather-bound notebook and a calm that reads like readiness. Renee had defended and prosecuted, moved through civil rights work long enough to know the limits of outrage and the uses of slow, persistent pressure. She sat with Mara and Javier and began naming the evidence like a surgeon counting instruments. "Timestamp it," she said. "Photograph the drive, note serials, create duplicates. We will need multiple copies stored off-site. Chain of custody begins now." She spoke the language of law, practical and exact, and the room began to feel like a workshop rather than a stage. Hank Merritt, the journalist who smelled a story before most people found names in the phone book, arrived with a camera and a gentle, insistent curiosity. He had the kind of questions that soften a subject and sharpen a case. How long did security keep footage before the overwrite? Who authorized the purge? Were there patterns to these incidents? Mara, Renee, Javier, and Hank formed the nucleus of a plan, not yet a public statement. Tessa and Guan, 2 analysts who had the kind of reputations that made procurement officers nervous, worked in quieter ways, through FOIA requests, through database searches that looked for contracts and payments. They found something like a seam, municipal budgets with line items that fed county facilities run by private vendors. Those contracts included clauses that provided performance metrics related to bed occupancy and community partnership initiatives that involved security training contracts with the very mall chain whose manager had called the police. The money trail was not dramatic in a single sentence. It came as 1,000 small pensions of logic: invoices, payments for consulting, grant applications with vague descriptions of community safety outcomes, a now familiar set of euphemisms.
Guan printed out spreadsheets that turned euphemisms into numbers. Tessa cross-referenced grant years with a rise in arrests for minor infractions in the district. The alignment was not automatic proof of wrongdoing, but it was a map of incentive. When parts of the system profit from arrests and bed days, the temptation to nudge enforcement into being is undeniable. Maya watched the work from the edge of it, an adolescent trying to be brave in a world where the adults were solving puzzles she had fallen into.
Her classmates' whispers made a new kind of noise. They were pitying looks in the grocery store, and a girl in algebra who had once been friendly stopped smiling in the hallways. Maya hated that everyone wanted to either patronize her or make her into a cause. She wanted ordinary things, an apology that meant something, a return to classes that did not treat her like an exhibit, a world where a mug and a receipt did not translate into bruises. At night, when the house grew quiet and Mara's classified folders were put away under a different lock, mother and daughter sat at the kitchen table with bandaged ice packs. Mara had called in favors, quiet conversations with supervisors, a gentle insistence that the investigation be kept above the pettiness of local politics. But it became obvious very quickly that being a powerful figure did not immunize you from how power fights back. Sometimes it made the push harder. People who felt cornered tightened their grips. "Do you want me to step back?" Mara asked, soft, during one of those nights. Her voice held the fatigue of someone who had spent decades making decisions for millions of strangers. Her supervisor's message, one terse text with the almost toneless word indefinito in it, meant to soften the blow of jurisdictional clarity, had been practical. Avoid public spectacle that could jeopardize a broader investigation. The word should have been a neutral placeholder in a bureaucrat's vocabulary. In practice, it felt like a hand placed on Mara's arm, weighing options. Maya looked up with bruises that had become a topographical map. "You can do both," she said. "You can keep your job and still make sure people see what happened. People will look if you show them the right things." Mara considered that. There was a calculus to every choice. Going quietly would preserve a career but risk erasure. Going loud could salvage the truth but cost reputation and leverage. A quieter path risked losing the possibility of accountability entirely. They chose to build a fortress of facts first, copies of everything, duplicated and dispersed, and then decide how the story would be told. Facts, Mara said, are hard to argue with when you get them all in one place. Javier's footage became the cornerstone of that fortress. He had captured not just the shove, but a pattern. Small, humiliating interactions with other teens in months prior, officers calibrating their enforcement to the edges of legality. The footage did not scream conspiracy. It hummed with the practical cadence of habit. In one clip, a man was escorted off the property for loitering when he had merely been waiting for a friend. In another, a teenage boy was cuffed for disorderly conduct after refusing to leave a bench. Each piece on its own might be ordinary. Together, they suggested a rulebook that favored arrests over de-escalation. Renee photographed wrist abrasions and ordered medical notes.
Hank began laying out a narrative that would be hard to ignore, one that combined the visual violence of the footage with the quiet arithmetic of contracts and budgets. Tessa and Guan found an intriguing clause in a 5-year procurement contract, a clause that rewarded community engagement outputs, tied in practice to a reported increase in safety incidents, a phrase that read like a metric dressed in pseudo-philanthropy. It was small, technical, and ugly. When they sat down to sketch what they would do with it, the room felt like a control center, maps spread like a chessboard. "If we go to the press now," Hank said, voice low, "we'll have a public storm. Good, but we'll be accused of going after the chief, the mall, and dragging a girl's life into the mud." He tapped the footage. "If we do it right, we can force them into the kind of transparency that leaves no easy cover story." Renee ran a finger along the edge of her notebook, the corners softened by years of use. "There are risks either way," she said. "We must protect Maya's privacy while making the facts undeniable. We build a package, footage, medical reports, the financial trail. We make sure FOIA requests are in. We prepare public statements that are not sensational, but that present a clear, factual chain of cause and effect. The chain of custody procedures were communicated like ritual. Make clones, note serials, photograph everything in high resolution, log who handled the evidence and when. They stored copies at an encrypted cloud that required multi-factor authentication and a legal hold. Every small protection they put in place felt like stitching a wound. The more they secured, the more fragile the town's narrative became. News, however, has its own impatience. Rumors flecked the edges of the quiet. that Chief Whitaker had called a closed meeting with the officers, that Deputy Clean had been seen at the precinct after hours, that a petty complaint file had vanished. The story's edges began to glow with rumor and fear, and with that glow came the first real countermeasures. The Clarke house received a demand to withdraw public talk pending internal review, a phrase printed by a lawyer and carried with the weight of institutional threat. Mara forwarded it to Renee and simply wrote, "We will not be silenced by requests that are designed to conceal." The threats matured. Tires slashed. A window at the family's car was smashed with a rock, and a note left that was more cowardice than threat. A single sentence, typed and left on the driver's seat, that read, "Don't make more trouble for yourself." It was meant to cultivate fear, to make the idea of persistence feel like an indulgence that had consequences. There were smaller cruelties too. A teacher at Maya's school made a pointed comment in class, a suggestion that some people were more likely to draw attention to themselves. Whispers turned to ostracism.
Maya, who had liked to play piano in the evenings, stopped going to practice because the idea of the quiet room felt risky. Her world had contracted to the space between her mother, the files, and the friends who had not yet chosen sides. At a late-night meeting in the Clarke house kitchen, Mara turned to Javier and said quietly, "If you ever feared for your safety, now is the time to say it." Javier's hands were wrapped around a mug so tight the knuckles whitened. He had looked over his shoulder for weeks. "I am willing," he said simply, "but I need it to be used right." He wanted his name out if necessary. He did not want to be the anonymous source who had given a town its shame. Renee laid out a timeline, a careful cadence that would, if they followed it, leave little space for the local actors to rewrite the incident. They would file a civil rights complaint. They would release footage to a vetted journalist. They would produce the financial trail in a way that tied incentive to practice without making conspiratorial leaps. "We don't smear people," Renee said. "We demonstrate pattern and motive. We invite oversight." Mara listened to the plan and felt the old thrum of operative certainty. Her career had taught her how to move people and institutions. Her motherhood taught her how to make time small enough to protect. There was a conversation she had with her own supervisor about risk the next morning. There would be consequences to a high-profile official who both bore the badge of an officer and the mantle of a parent. But the alternative, letting a pattern calcify into acceptable brutality, was not an option. When the first public article ran, a lean, careful piece by Hank that showed the footage and raised the evidence of contracts, the reaction was immediate. People watched the video and saw what Javier had captured with hands that trembled only in the ethics of witness. Comments poured in. Anger, grief, calculated indifference, thinly veiled support for the officers. Chief Whitaker released a statement that promised cooperation. The PR machine turned, measured, and precise. Promises to investigate, references to policy reviews, a suggestion of human error. The machine's grease, however, was sweaty with the fear of exposure. There were calls Mara could feel in the way her phone vibrated with a number she recognized. "Stay out of the courtroom," her supervisor said. "Consider your post, consider your badge." It was not an order. It was a pressure applied where it would hurt most. The career that allowed her leverage, and the public trust she needed to wield to finish what she had started. Maya watched all of this like a satellite passing over the faces of the people who had hurt her. She was healing, slowly, painfully, and she was growing strange in new ways. Where once she had been ordinary, the public had made her symbol. She hated the way people now flattened her into a narrative that suited their outrage.
Yet she also recognized that her small pain had been a keyhole for a much larger room full of problems, contracts, incentives, and people who had learned to keep their hands clean by passing the mess to others. Just before dawn on a Friday, Javier knocked on the Clarke house door and handed over another drawer-burned disc. "This one's the mall's night feed," he said. "They told us it cleared. It didn't. I kept a copy." Mara took it without ceremony and sat at her kitchen table to watch the night in little boxes, quiet corridors, patrol lights cutting the darkness, a shape moving in the periphery. In one clip, taken weeks before Maya's arrest, an officer had walked up to a group of teens and, with an aggressive curiosity, insisted they move along. In the frame after that, 2 teens were led to a patrol car whose door closed like a book. Mara watched until the first light touched the roof lines and then called Renee. "I'm ready," she said. "Set the chain of custody protocols. Get me a secure press list. We will not let this be absorbed into the past by a press release and a charity dinner." The plan formed like a fold in a map. They would assemble everything and decide how and when to place it where it would be impossible to ignore. They would not be reckless. They would be meticulous.
They would not use language that invited the town to choose sides blindly. They would show the evidence and allow the public to make the judgment that institutions were trying to avoid. Yet every step was dangerous. People who had built their lives around small protections do not yield ground kindly. When the call came that Chief Whitaker had convened an emergency meeting with the council, Mara felt the slow tightening of a noose that was actually an opening. The officials were collecting themselves to respond, to buy time, to build a story of their own. The county lawyer wanted to discuss communication strategy. The chief wanted to calm the community. Mara prepared to respond with facts. The next move would require precision and courage from people who had had neither one the luxury of for very long. As dawn rolled toward noon, the team met in a back office where the light came through Venetian blinds and turned stacks of paper into a kind of evidence landscape. They built backups, created timestamps, notarized copies, and prepared a short, unadorned statement that would be given to the press at a moment they chose. Outside, life went on. Teenagers bought prom dresses at the mall. Couples argued about dinner. Inside the office, the air smelled like coffee and paper and the tight sweetness of a plan coming together. Maya sat with a bandage at her temple and tried, with an adolescent's mixed improvised bravery, to imagine standing in a room years from now where people would be talking about courage as if it were a tidy concept. Right now, courage was a sequence of small practicalities. Secure the drive, find the contract, make the copies, call the lawyer.
And yet, in the very week that everything was being readied, other forces moved. An unnamed donor sent a folded letter to the chief's office that praised the department for maintaining order. A local conservative talk show hosted a caller who said, plainly, that the police do the work no one else wants. The undercurrent intensified. The protection that had once been like a rumor now became a concert of noise intended to drown out the truth. The team knew better than to be naive. They also knew that the first successful lever in a fight like this was not the dramatic reveal, it was the steady accumulation of incontrovertible facts. If they could stitch together image, timestamp, contract, and pattern, then the town's PR would be forced not to peddle denial, but to answer. They did not yet know who would blink first, but they knew who had already tried to erase what had happened. A kernel of a crime that began with a mug and a receipt and escalated into a bruise on a small girl's life. They had a story that would live in footage, in ledgers, in the slowly hardening record of injustice. The next step was deciding where to lay it down so the light would get in and the town could no longer pretend it had not happened. They had a story that would live in footage, in ledgers, in the slowly hardening record of injustice. The next step was deciding where to lay it down so the light would get in and the town could no longer pretend it had not happened. They agreed after long conversations and quieter arguments about risk on a single place where denial would be hardest to sustain. The county's annual Public Safety and Community Partnership Awards. The night the police chief stood on stage beneath bright lights and the council honored the very officers whose action patterns the team had mapped. It was a stage designed for tribute, with a towering screen behind the lectern and cameras primed for applause. If anything could make a practiced PR machine fold, it was the disconnect between what the screen promised, glossy portraits and smiling plaques, and what Javier's footage could show. The weeks before the ceremony were a study in logistics. Renee cataloged every item like a surgeon assigning instruments. Photographs of injuries, notarized statements, email chains showing the clearing of server logs, duplicate drives in hardened safes, a sealed envelope entrusted to a third-party trustee that contained the original thumb drive Javier had given them, kept as a legal anchor should someone later allege tampering. Tessa and Guan, who've worked with procurement files until they read like scripture, printed a packet thick with invoices, clause excerpts, deposit maps, and transfer logs. They made slides that looked clean and boring, spreadsheets and highlighted phrases, because the dullness made the implications more terrible. Line items labeled consulting that walked into a contractor's account on a timeline that matched a spike in minor arrests.
Hank rehearsed his angles. He arranged for 2 independent streams, one through a local station he trusted, and a parallel live feed to a national site he had contacts at. He encoded deadman triggers with a backup journalist in another city. If the feed was interrupted, the backup would push the same material. They would not rely on the county's event tech or the chief's press officer to cooperate. They would use the stage only as a place where attention could be guaranteed. The rest would be theirs. Mara called in a favor to an assistant U.S. attorney she had worked with years ago. "We need to be in legal alignment," she said. The attorney, practical, blunt, responded that there would be constraints, that federal oversight could not be flippantly brandished at a civic awards banquet. To do so without probable cause would invite litigation and mess with ongoing inquiry. Indefinito, the reply read in Mara's head, a bureaucratic placeholder that meant caution. It also meant the team would have to achieve a public visibility that forced official movement while keeping the technical legal wheels in motion. There were practical worries too.
The event organizers insisted the awards night would be closed to political statements. Whitaker's office had already hinted that any attempt to upstage the ceremony would be inappropriate. A local columnist said casually on the phone that nothing sows chaos like a surprise on stage. Mara's supervisor texted once more, "Consider the career implications." Mara stared at the message and then deleted it. For every reputation there was a truth, and for Maya there was a scraped temple and a receipt. They made contingency plans to stream if physically barred. They arranged for Hank to be in the press pit under the pretense of covering the awards. Renee filed a parallel set of FOIA requests timed to the event, so there would be a paper trail showing they were exercising legal process even as they revealed the facts. Javier, despite the anxiety that had never left him, agreed to be present at the venue, partly to see his footage perform the act of truth, partly because being there made him feel less like a coward and more like a witness. Threats ratcheted up in the thin days before the awards. Someone carefully slashed one of the spare tires on Mara's car while it sat in the driveway, the cut precise and clinical. A note left on the Clarke doorstep read in worn black ink, "Stop digging into things that aren't your business." It was the same sentiment rendered in a different medium, the anonymous pressure intended to move the Clarke household into compliance. Mara forwarded the note to Renee and to her supervisor. The assistant U.S. attorney advised recording everything and suggested protective measures if the threat scale required it. Javier moved his wife and daughter to a relative's house for a few nights. He whispered to Mara, "I'm ready if we need to go public. Just tell me where to stand."
On the afternoon of the ceremony, the town hall filled with the audience of civic life, retirees with season tickets to controversy, PTA presidents who liked their crimes small and contained, union representatives with free neckties, and the local press corps with notepads already warm. Chief Whitaker arrived on stage in a dark suit, a practiced smile like a varnish. The mayor made small talk into the microphone. Officers in pressed uniforms filed into the first rows and nodded at familiar faces. The program was punctual, scheduled to the minute. Backstage, Mara stood with Maya and felt the girl's hand in hers. Maya, her hair pulled carefully back to keep it from catching the stage lights, wore a dress that was quiet and not meant to be noticed. Her skin was pale in a way that made stage lights seem bright and tender. She kept her sunglasses in her pocket as a small defense against the glare. "You sure?" Mara asked, thumbed briefly at the bandage at Maya's temple. Maya looked up. "I want them to see it," she said. "If it has to be my face, then so be it. I don't want edges left for someone else to fill in." Hank took his position among the press and sent a small, tight message to the team. "Ready in 3. Tessa and Guan sat in a van down the street, monitors set up like the bridge of a ship, ready to send the slides that would translate spreadsheets into a narrative. Renee moved through the crowd like a calm presence with a legal pad and the kind of look that discourages small talk. At 20 minutes to the scheduled awards, a man in a blue suit approached the AV technician. He introduced himself with a practiced charm that opened many doors, Hank's colleague, and asked for a quick probing test of the feed, a polite request that the tech, used to last-minute ad campaigns and mayoral speeches, complied with. The tech fed live images, unaware of what they would show in an hour. The stage was a vulnerability of positive attention. The team turned it into a tool. The program honored a dozen officers for community outreach. The crowd applauded with all the polite heat of people at a function where no one wishes to be incensed. Then the lights shifted, and Chief Whitaker approached the lectern. Her speech began with the usual rhetorical scaffolding: gratitude for families, dedication to service, trust between police and the public. Her words made a comfortable narrative, the department as a benevolent force. Someone in the back pushed a button. The screen, planned to show a montage of department highlights, instead flickered. The montage stuttered. Then the mall footage rolled. The room's temperature dropped as the slide switched into Javier's frame. It was unflinching in its ordinariness. The mall floor, the little paper bag, the receipt, the officers approaching. The sound came through with a rawness that made the speech in the room feel like background noise.
The shove, the slam to pavement, the gasp. What had been ordinary by witnesses became undeniable on a screen 5 stories tall. Gasps and a scattered sound like a single animal hurrying away from something. Phones popped up. Chief Whitaker's smile tightened. She stepped back from the mic, the cadence of her prepared remarks interrupted. "We are experiencing technical difficulties," she said, but the difficulties were not with the lights. The footage rolled on. Then the slide changed. Timestamps and a voice recording. An audio clip where Rick Daly's voice was intelligible, directing the initial complaint. Then a sequence of expense spreadsheets and clause excerpts. Guan's slide showed a month-to-month ledger where consulting fees matched deposits into an account tied to a vendor that operated a local detention center. Tessa's annotated notes circled phrases like performance metrics. The dry text made the room colder. This was not merely a mistake. It was a pattern overlaying policy. Someone in the audience shouted, "Turn it off!"
but the sound of outrage only made other people take out their phones and stream. The chief's press officer moved toward the stage with a practiced step, a man whose job was smoothing things until they could be explained into something acceptable. He reached for the AV technician. The technician's hand hovered over a switch, but the feed was not coming from the tech's console. It was coming from a remote source, a live stream that could not be immediately cut without cutting the feed to the thousands now watching online. The net had grown teeth. Officers in the front row rose. Coyle's face was the deep red of someone who had not expected inquiry to be public. Briggs' jaw tightened. Sergeant Paul Harlan, whose face had a history of telling people what to do before they thought to ask, moved to the stage more aggressively than was protocol. He strode as if he could end the embarrassment with a blunt instrument. Harlan lunged for the microphone stand as a slide shifted to close-ups of the notes Mara had taken at the mall, the badge numbers, the time-stamped request for footage. "This is slander," he said into the mic, his voice projected beyond its reach. "This is a coordinated hit, a political witch hunt." Hank's camera caught his movement. Maya stood, pale and steady, and the officer's hand reached out, not toward her, but toward the laptop perched on a side table. Whitaker's voice was tight on the edge of demand. "Shut that down!" Daly, now standing at the edge of the stage like a stagehand who had overreached, cursed under his breath. For a heartbeat, strategy and panic collided. Harlan was not alone in his calculation. Erase the frame, erase the story. He lunged across the stage, aiming for the laptop, fingers colliding with the plastic and metal. A tech in the wings tried to pull the cords.
The plug wrenched and the screen flickered, but Hank's second feed, configured to a cloud stream beyond the reach of an unplugged HDMI, kept broadcasting. The room erupted. A scuffle broke out. A woman in the audience screamed. An officer shoved a cameraman who tried to get closer. A hand closed around Hank's shoulder. Harlan, red-faced, grabbed the laptop again, and it slid off the table with a sound like a body striking wood. In the scramble, Mason Briggs shoved a volunteer from the stage and cursed, "Get off the stage!" The volunteer stumbled into a folding chair, and the orderly chairs became a tumble of human bodies bargaining for position. At that moment, the doors flew open near the back of the room. Men in plain suits moved with purposeful speed. Federal agents, badges shown for a flash, the small, exacting gestures of people who do this for a living. They moved through the chaos like a new weather front. Someone in the front row tried to bar them. The lead agent held up a pair of warrants, the paper edges crisp in his hand. "Ellen Whitaker," he said, "you are under arrest. You need to step away from the lectern." The name landed like a struck bell. There was a beat in which every man in a uniform measured his survival against the sudden, practical force of federal paperwork. Coyle's face drained. Briggs looked around for allies and found none. Whitaker's practiced smile collapsed into something smaller and raw. "This is an overreach," she said. "You have no jurisdiction." And an agent, patient and lethal with legalese, said, "We have authority in preliminary inquiry. This action is under federal oversight." The room transformed into a series of small, sudden battles as the agents attempted to control the immediate space while other officers bristled with the instinct to protect their own. One officer, desperate and afraid, shoved a federal agent and tried to wrench Whitaker out of the agent's hand. Hands closed. The microphone fell. Maya could see the metallic glint of a belt under a jacket where another officer reached for a radio. The scene had become a crucible of the two different kinds of force, the procedural, quiet power of a warrant, and the raw, impulsive force of people who felt their careers and reputations evaporating. Hank's live feed captured everything in close detail. Whitaker being guided off the stage, Coyle's face a portrait of disbelief as two agents approached him and said in measured voices that he was a subject of inquiry and would need to remain available. Briggs being led away by a detective from another county who had been called in as neutral support. The screens that had been playing spreadsheets now showed a tableau the town had not planned for. The chief cuffs being applied, the officers' collars rumpled as they were escorted. The mall manager's face set in an expression that said, simultaneously, "I had no idea," and "I knew everything." There were resistances. Harlan tried to keep the microphone, to keep the narrative in his hands, to prevent the footage from being the sole storyteller. He slammed a table and yelled for order, as if his voice could supersede the audiovisual evidence. The agents held up their credentials, took names, and read rites that felt like incantations in a room suddenly full of cameras and strangers. Coyle was escorted. Briggs walked with a gait that was half defiance and half resignation, and Whitaker, who had once advised mayors on optics, now had to lean on a table to keep her balance, as two agents read her possible charges and took her statements. Outside, the parking lot had become a theater of its own. Patrol cars still idled like confused beasts. Conversations morphed into longer arguments about rights and process. The crowd outside swelled with people streaming in, high with attention and low with fury. The county's PR office had predicted this exact possibility in their darker imaginings. Now the prediction was a live feed reality. Reporters called in lawyers. The mayor called for calm and then called again to ask whether calming was still possible. The arrest itself was only the beginning of the legal choreography. Mara's phone buzzed and lit with texts. "Are you okay? We saw it live. Is the deployment legal?" Her supervisor's earlier indefinido had become in practice the federal agent's operational decision. It was a relief and a risk. Evidence of wrongdoing had been made public in a way that forced an official response, and that response included the kind of authority that could secure both people and materials. The agents moved quickly to narcotize the loose narrative. They executed warrants to seize servers from the station, to seize Daly's managerial logs, and to secure the mall's archived footage. They put a temporary hold on contracts and notified the county that their procurement accounts would be frozen pending an audit. Those procedural moves were the sorts of things that fed rumor mills for weeks. The private detention contractor, when contacted, declared that they were cooperating with authorities and would review contracts. The board of the municipal provider convened a special meeting and placed several executives on administrative leave. The mayor, stung by the speed with which the affair had become electrified, asked for patience and promised full transparency. The judge who signed the warrants would later be thanked for moving with appropriate speed. Some would call it an overcorrection, others a long overdue evening of recalibration. Within 48 hours, Chief Whitaker had submitted a resignation letter couched in language that avoided conceding guilt but acknowledged the need for a clear path forward. "I resign to allow for an unfettered review," she wrote. Sergeant Harlan applied for administrative leave. Coyle and Briggs were placed on unpaid status while internal affairs and federal investigators built their case.
The county put a temporary hold on any new contracts with the detention vendor. The immediate cascade of administrative consequences was not in itself proof of guilt, but it was proof that the town's machinery had to realign to a new reality. The facts were now public. The public reaction was furious and messy and sometimes incoherent. People who had never thought much about procurement clauses learned to read spreadsheets. Community groups organized rallies. There were vigils for a culture of accountability. There were also ugly displays from people who felt cornered and accused. Some shouted for retaliation rather than reform. The town split in colors of raging argument, and social media, as ever, made every division bigger than it had been in the flesh. Maya, on the outside of this political fray, watched the news with a complicated smallness. She was relieved in ways that made her feel guilty. The man who had shoved her had been publicly exposed and stripped of disguise, and yet her life had been scrubbed raw. There were nights when the headlines hurt her like wind on bare skin. Her piano bench sat quiet in the living room. Her phone pinged constantly with requests for comment. She answered few. Renee insisted she keep healing before speaking. "You don't owe everyone your story," the lawyer said. "You owe the truth, and you give it on your terms." Javier became, by necessity and choice, public. He consented to an interview with Hank that was careful and human. He explained why he had kept the footage and how he had finally brought it forward. "I didn't want to get anyone fired," he said. "I just wanted someone to see what happened." People called him brave. People also whispered about consequences, reprisals, a ruined career. Federal agencies offered protective steps, and while the exact nature of those safety protocols was indefinido in public conversation, they involved at least some measures to ensure that crucial witnesses could not be easily threatened. The financial trail became a focus of investigative reporting that read like a detective novel of sewn-up budgets. Tessa and Guan's spreadsheets were quoted in articles and presented in public meetings as a cautionary exemplar of how incentives can warp practice. The procurement clauses were parsed until they yielded only fragments of plausible excuses and the cold arithmetic of zip codes and deposits. The narrative wasn't a single act of corruption. It was a city-sized weave of small decisions and permissive contracts that, when stacked, produced an outcome in which arrests for minor infractions buttressed budgetary desires. People who had sponsored the contracts in good faith argued that oversight had failed them. Others said the contracts had been written knowing what they might incentivize. There were legal pushbacks, too. The county filed motions arguing that some evidence had been improperly obtained in the heat of the onstage reveal. Attorneys for the detained officers argued about chain of custody issues and possible entrapment. In court filings that read with the dryness of legalese, lawyers fought over what constituted the public interest and what constituted reckless exposure. Those fights were to be expected. They were protocol's own protective routines.
The team had prepared for that: the duplicates, the notary stamps, the witness statements. That was the work the lawyers did to make a narrative survive skepticism. For the Clarke family, the middle months that followed were a weave of small recoveries and ongoing vigilance. Maya returned to classes when she felt she could, though the humiliation in some hallways had not entirely dissolved. A school assembly was called, where administrators spoke of lessons learned, and Deputy Clean, the official who had helped flag her in the district database, suddenly found herself answering questions before a school board that demanded reforms to internal reporting and database access. Clean offered apologies in public that sometimes sounded rehearsed and sometimes genuine. Her job was under review. Maya's circle of friends thinned and reformed. Some who had turned away returned with handshakes that did not demand credit. Some who had been passive allies found a voice. A neighborhood group organized to petition the school to adopt a new anti-harassment policy and to require restorative practices that focused on mediation and acknowledgement rather than simple punishment. Renee kept the hard legal work moving, sketches of complaints, filings, and motions that would over months thread through the system. She advised Vivian and the family not to treat the day's arrests as an end. Legal processes take time, evidence must be tested, and institutions can build walls as quickly as they can be toppled. "We win by being right," she told Maya once in a conversation about public statements. "We don't win by shouting. The law requires patience." There were symbolic victories that nevertheless mattered. The detention vendor's board chair resigned under pressure, in a letter that carefully avoided admitting malfeasance but acknowledged a failure to fully account for outcomes. A review committee was formed, with Tessa and Guon's spreadsheets becoming an exhibit for why more stringent oversight was necessary. The mayor appointed a task force to rewrite tender processes, and the county council agreed to audit all contracts awarded in the past 5 years. These were bureaucratic steps that did not feel like victories. Legal and financial reform is rarely quick, but they were steps in the direction of accountability. There was also the human cost. Coyle and Briggs, whose images were now part of the town's memory, faced criminal investigation and professional suspension. Harlan faced internal charges for his conduct on stage.
Whitaker's resignation carried with it a stipend of questions about who in the higher circles had known what and when. The public wanted a clean ending, a solitary villain, and a crisp sentence. The reality was messier. Names and faces, some guilty by pattern and some by complicity, others by coincidence. The legal process would sort details with the patient cruelty of courts. Through it all, the Clarke household tried to make room for ordinary evenings. Mara returned to work in fits and starts, constrained by the weight of both her office's caution and the demands of the investigation she had helped catalyze. She attended meetings, wrote memos, and quietly refused offers that would have taken her away from the oversight she believed she might yet influence. Her supervisor remained cautious. An occasional INDEFINIDEL flagged the border between what was operationally allowed and what might be career-limiting. Yet she continued to meet with Renee and the team in the evenings, constructing careful filing strategies, prepping witness depositions, and making sure that no paper was left unaccounted for. The town's civic calendar bloomed with panels and forums and angry radio calls. People who had once ignored municipal budgets now read them with hungry eyes. The young did what young people have long done. They organized on social media, held vigils, and drew banners. Older people found themselves at public comment sections, asking for transparency in ways that felt new and earnest. In the scrimmage of public discourse, the story did its job. The system that had once been invisible now had to be visible. Months passed before the town settled into a new rhythm. Some officers were quietly reassigned. Others faced formal indictments. The vendors' contracts were renegotiated under the supervision of new committee oversight. The school enacted protocols to prevent the kind of database flagging that had scarred Maya's record. The specifics of prosecutions and outcomes remained, as Renee always cautioned, matters of process. Nothing guaranteed, everything plausible. The legal calendar was long, and names would be tried in courtrooms and in the press. One of the slowest and most consequential outcomes was the way the conversation changed at a personal level. People began to ask better questions. When are arrests truly necessary? Who benefits from the metrics that define success in public safety? Could a system be structured in a way that privileges safety without creating perverse incentives for arrest volume? These questions moved the work from a single-night spectacle into a longer civic education. The emotional arc for Maya bent towards a quieter, more private kind of restoration. The physical bruise on her temple faded into pale skin.
The scar, small and stubborn, became part of the story she told less often and with more calm. She began playing piano again, fingers returning to scales as if through repetition the world could be made orderly.
She found herself speaking to classes now and then, not to be a symbol, but because the act of telling things out loud made them less monstrous. "It isn't that I'm a hero," she said once to a group of students. "I am someone who had something happen to me and decided that the people who could stop it should be known. You can say that if you see something, say something, but you should also say it loudly and keep the receipts." Renee watched Maya as a client and as a human being. The lawyer deferred public statements to Maya and to Mara, insisting on measured responses that would not derail investigations. "You have months ahead of you," Renee said at one point, in a tone that acknowledged the weight of both justice and personal life. "You may feel like the world will always be watching. That is true for a while. It gets quieter, and then you have to decide how to live in the new quiet." In the quieter months, Xavier received a small honor. The mall's newly appointed independent oversight board publicly thanked him for bringing forward material and asked for stronger whistleblower protections. Xavier's life did not become entirely easy. He remained nervous about retaliation, and when his name appeared in op-eds, he felt the cold in his chest. But he also felt relief. The community had recognized him as a moral actor rather than as a traitor to his old colleagues. The small certificate and the handshake from a council member did not erase the months of fear, but they altered the context in which that fear had lived. When a special investigator later released a redacted report, the kind of document that reads like a long list of cause and effect, readers found in it a map of how things had gone wrong. Small managerial cues, a complaint culture that had turned into practice, budgets that prioritized occupancy. The report's recommendations were practical: better audit protocols, stricter oversight of contract language, mandatory transparency clauses for body cam data retention, independent review boards, and they contained no theatrical language. They were work orders, not speeches. At the very end of one long summer, when dusk softened the edges of the town like an apology, Maya stood at a podium, not at a ceremony of confrontation, but at her high school graduation. The auditorium had a different roster of faces: classmates, a few reporters who had come to cover the new normal, teachers whose lessons had stretched into civics rather than algebra. The stage lights felt less ominous than they had that night in the county hall. Maya's dress was simple. Her mother sat in the front row, hair pulled back, and there was an expression under Mara's calm that had been earned in months of hard choices. Maya's speech was not a manifesto. She did not ask for revenge, nor did she demand a single punishment. She spoke of being seen and of the responsibility that comes with vision.
"This town taught me," she said, voice steady with the thin ring of adolescence and the steel that trauma hardens, "that being visible can be dangerous and necessary at once. Sometimes the people who hurt you will hide behind routines and dull paperwork. Sometimes a receipt and a friend with a camera are the only things between a story and erasure." She paused. A murmur rose. A woman in the back dabbed at her eyes. "We learned to make our facts hard to deny," Maya continued. "We learned that courage is often not the flash of a single act, but the slow accumulation of truths. If you see something wrong, don't look away, but protect yourself. Tell the truth as best you can, and make sure someone keeps the proof." When she finished, there was applause, the kind that comes from the honest and complicated places of a community learning to be better. Mara hugged her, quick and full, and for a moment the world boiled down to the kitchen table and bandages and the small private routines that had rebuilt a life. They had not fixed everything. Many of the old patterns remained embedded in people who had not been examined. Many policies would require years to change. But one small life had been preserved from erasure by stubborn people who refused to let the record be rewritten. In the weeks and months that followed graduation, the town continued to process the aftermath. Investigations advanced, some cases moved to trial, some officers pleaded to misdemeanors, others fought charges, lawsuits were filed and settlements discussed, some families received quiet apologies. The detention contractor agreed to new oversight, and the county rewrote procurement guidelines with clauses that made pay-for-performance metrics more difficult to weaponize. Mara returned to her work, sometimes publicly, sometimes in the quieter spaces where a federal agent does the work that feels like bureaucracy but is actually crucial: preserving data, ensuring prosecutions are not undermined, protecting witnesses. Her career had been made riskier by her visibility. It had also gained a new dimension, a responsibility she could not unlearn. She had paid a price in scrutiny, but gained a deeper reach for the reform she wanted to see. People would tell the story in different ways, about the mug, about the shove,
about the glittering screen that made a town face itself. Historians might reduce it to a line about a pivotal year when a small town learned to legislate restraint into its institutions. For those who had been there, the memory would be textured: the shock of a badge, the sound of a microphone being wrested free, the creeping realization that incentives structure behavior. The last scene of this chapter was not a courtroom verdict or a policy paper, but a small, quiet dinner at the Clarke home. The bandage on Maya's temple was long gone. The family sat around a table with takeout containers and the comfortable clatter of crockery.
Javier was there, invited as a friend rather than a whistleblower in the headlines. Renee had come by with new filing dates and the dry humor of someone who has seen too much. Hank sent a link to a piece he'd written about community resilience and the cost of truth. Tessa and Guan called in from a monitor to say that the procurement rewrite had been adopted as an ordinance. Small victories stacked like plates. Maya reached across the table to take Mara's hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of months. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't grandiose, it was the adolescent gratitude that meant everything had been hard, and yet someone had been there to make it manageable. Mara smiled and squeezed back, and in that pressure were the minutes and hours of an ordinary parent's labor. Calls made, paperwork ensured, an insistence that a child's pain be counted, not erased. They had not ended the problem. The town would have to remain vigilant. The next scandal might be less visible and require even sharper observation. But for that one family, and for a cluster of people who had chosen to act, Javier, Renee, Hank, Tessa, Guan, and the others, the notion that power would go unchecked had been, for a time, unsettled. The arrests and the audits had not magically healed the structural incentives that fed bad behavior. They had, however, demonstrated that the architecture that allows wrongdoing can be pried open by evidence and determination. As night fell and the dishes were cleared away, Maya walked out to the small porch and looked at the streetlights. She felt the ache of months recede into something like a wound that might ultimately scar. She had become more careful with whom she trusted and more willing to press her case when she believed people were in the wrong. The town had learned a lesson about the weight of receipts and the force of cameras. The world, as ever, would keep turning, some people watching, some doing the work, most moving through the minutes unconcerned. For now, there was a tentative peace.